Over the last couple of years, HBO have announced a number of Game of Thrones prequels, sequels, and spin-offs, which have been dubbed as successor shows. Most are still on track to come out in the next couple years, while others have been shelved indefinitely, and one series had an entire pilot episode filmed. However, it did not meet HBO's expectations and was ultimately cancelled. This video will cover all of the upcoming, cancelled, and rumoured TV shows, movies, and animated series set in the Game of Thrones universe, as well as what to expect from each show, which ones have source material from the big man to draw from, and which ones are HBO pulling out of their arse. The next successor show to air will be A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. It was initially supposed to air in 2025, but recently it has been reported that the series has been pushed to 2026. The first season is set to adapt the first book, The Hedge Knight by George R. R. Martin, which picks up with the death of Sir Arlen of Pennytree. His squire Duncan adopts the knight's armor, horses, and equipment and heads to the town of Ashford, hoping to enlist in a tournament to earn gold and renown as a knight. On the way there, he meets a mysterious boy named Egg, who becomes his squire. Dunk faces the struggle of proving himself as a newly made knight, but stands firm in his morals, defending the defenseless, which eventually lands him in hot water. To prove his actions were just in the eyes of gods and men, Dunk faces a trial by combat. But unlike the trials we saw in Game of Thrones, Dunk faces a trial by 7, where 7 face off against 7. The result of the trial would have far-reaching consequences that impacted the entire realm and echoed throughout the history of Westeros. The cast includes Peter Claffey as Sir Duncan the Tall. Claffey stands at 6'4", while Dunk is described as an inch shorter than 7 foot. Sir Duncan's height is an important element to his character. Not only does he draw his epithet from his stature, but his size is his main advantage in combat. It will be interesting to see how the series might use camera angles or other techniques to show Dunk as a towering figure. A number of other actors have also been cast for the main roles, and overall it looks promising. The series is slated to run for 6 episodes. Filming began in June 2024 and concluded in September. The show was supposed to release in 2025, but has been pushed to 2026. While season 1 aims to adapt the first Dunk and Egg novella, George has also written 2 other books in the series, Sworn Sword and The Mystery Knight. He has previously indicated that he hopes to write up to a dozen more stories following the duo, with the next book likely being The She-Wolves of Winterfell, which places Dunk and Egg in Winterfell in the midst of a Stark succession crisis in the north. So for the first 3 seasons of the show, there is book material that the series can adapt, but beyond that 3-season arc, the showrunners will likely be making it up. So at the very least, we should get 3 seasons of great TV. While House of the Dragon was the first successor show to make it to the screen, there was another series planned before Hot D that had an entire pilot episode filmed. The series was titled Bloodmoon, or The Long Night. It was to be set in the Age of Heroes, a time period that saw legendary figures rise all across Westeros, many of which would eventually found the great houses of the realm. The time period concluded with the Long Night, when the White Walkers came for the first time, sweeping across Westeros, bringing cold, ice, and death, until they were ultimately defeated by the last hero. The plan for the series to delve into the White Walkers is likely one of the main reasons we barely got any answers regarding them in Game of Thrones. HBO seemed to be planning to make all of the juicy lore reveals in Bloodmoon, and the White Walkers' origins and motivations would have been a main draw for audiences to tune in to watch the show. Over the years, images, plotlines, and the general plan for the series have leaked online, most of which can be seen on a Forum of Ice and Fire post. A few of the more interesting leaked plot points indicated that the Long Night was partially caused by a meteor shower impacting in the north, with the resulting plume covering Westeros' sky in an unending night. The series would also bring to life the many myths about the founding of several great houses, at the very least showing Bran the Builder, the founder of House Stark, and Lan the Clever. Episode 1 featured a wedding between a Stark princess and the last Casterly. The Casterlys were the original rulers of Casterly Rock. However, a love triangle would quickly form with a cousin of the last Casterly, who was known as Lan the Clever, to be played by Jamie Campbell Bower. The leaks implied that Lan would show interest in the Stark princess, eventually leading to him throwing down his cousin and claiming Casterly Rock, which would also show the foundation of House Lannister. Other leaks surrounding the series suggested that the Andals would also be present in Westeros, despite the fact that the Andal invasion of Westeros would not occur for hundreds, if not thousands of years after the events of the time period the series was aiming to portray. However, the most criticized leaks surrounded HBO's intent to drastically change the lore behind the Children of the Forest. In the books, they are a distinctly non-human race of magical creatures who warred against the First Men in the Dawn Age for thousands of years. But they were outnumbered, and in their desperation, the children performed a powerful magical ritual that shattered the land bridge that once connected Westeros to Essos that the First Men had been using to migrate to Westeros. After this event, a peace formed between the children and the First Men. Through this peace, it is implied that the children and the First Men clapped cheeks. The mixing of their bloodlines would eventually lead to the First Men possessing warging and greensight abilities. The pact would also usher in the Age of Heroes. However, HBO wanted to portray the original Children of the Forest as dark-skinned humans and not non-magical creatures of legend. For Bloodmoon, HBO came up with a new story for the children, splitting them into two factions during their war against the First Men, with one side realizing that the First Men were going to win, so they switched to support their invaders. This group would become the Green Men, who would teach the First Men about the Old Gods and the Weirwoods. However, one of these Green Men would eventually defect back to the Children of the Forest and help them to call down the Hammer of the Waters to attack the First Men. In retaliation, the Green Men who stayed loyal to the First Men magically cursed the Children of the Forest, transforming them from dark-skinned humans into non-human creatures, fundamentally altering their established book lore. Supposedly in revenge, the now transformed Children of the Forest would create the White Walkers and initiate the Long Night. While the leaks were not all bad, they indicated that HBO aimed to compress and muddy the time periods that George has long established, blending events and elements from the Dawn Age, the Age of Heroes, and the Andal invasion of Westeros into one time period that would have likely resulted in a fundamentally different world than what George has envisioned in his A Song of Ice and Fire book series. For whatever reason, HBO ultimately did not greenlight the series for a full season, and instead went all in on House of the Dragon. Snow is the only sequel series that has been confirmed to be in development by HBO. The series was set to follow Jon Snow after the events of Game of Thrones. In 2022, it was revealed that Kit Harington was spearheading the project with his own team of writers as they attempted to develop a series that would do justice to the character. While Jon Snow is perhaps one of the more logical characters to do a sequel series on, the writers ultimately could not come up with a compelling enough idea for HBO to greenlight the series. And by 2024, the project had been shelved, though the CEO has stated that maybe they will revisit this idea sometime in the future. It is fun to speculate what this series would have been about. Kit Harington did hint that it would be more of a character piece, focusing on Jon Snow coming to grips with his actions and the deaths of those he had loved and cared about, rather than a fantasy action spectacle that the later seasons of Thrones became. While pure speculation, some fans have theorized a number of wild storylines the series could have followed. One suggested that Grey Worm and Dario traveled to the north in search of Jon Snow in order to enact their revenge for Jon killing Daenerys. Another with Jon being forced to travel back south when it becomes apparent that having an all-seeing, all-knowing, godlike king might not be such a good idea, which would have pit Jon against Bran, a rivalry that was outlined in George R.R. Martin's original draft for Game of Thrones. Perhaps some in the realm would see Bran's rule as tyrannical, as he is able to quash rebellions before they can even take root, and his ability to push humanity towards his perceived end might not be the greatest thing for free will. A wilder theory suggests that at the end of Game of Thrones, Drogon flew Daenerys off to Essos, where he found a fire priest to revive her in a similar manner to how Jon Snow was revived in the main series. Daenerys, now having returned, is filled with a singular desire of revenge, which is reminiscent of when Catelyn Stark is revived in the books, and her personality and soul have been so stripped away, she is left with her obsession with revenge against anyone involved with the Red Wedding. I think these fan theories kind of highlight why a Jon Snow sequel series is not a good idea. By the time of House of the Dragon, Corlys Velaryon is a living legend. He elevated his house to become the richest in all of Westeros. He acquired this wealth and reputation from 9 great voyages, which saw Corlys travel across much of the known world. HBO plans to cover these 9 great adventures in an animated series titled The Seasnake. George has outlined 4 of the 9 great voyages. The first first where Corlys sailed to Yi Ti and Leng, returning with wealth in spice, silk, and jade that doubled House Velarion's wealth. The second where he became the first Westerosi to reach Asshai. It was here that Corlys lost half of his crew and his love. He also supposedly saw Sunchaser, the vessel of Alyssa Farman, who some decades prior had sailed west of Westeros. On his third voyage, Corlys travelled to the Shivering Sea in the far north of Essos, and for his ninth voyage, Corlys travelled to Karth, returning to Westeros with an astonishing amount of wealth that pushed House Velaryon to become the wealthiest family in all of Westeros. Of these 4 voyages, there is ample opportunity to show the world beyond Westeros, delving deeper into Essos, exploring different cultures, magic, and bringing the extensive world-building elements from the books into the show universe. The series being animated can also more easily show all of these different regions, something that would be expensive to produce in live action. However, the 5 remaining voyages introduce the potential for HBO's writers to implement their own ideas of where Corlys ventured to and what he experienced, likely taking the Seasnake into uncharted waters lore-wise. While some locations make sense for Corlys to have visited, like Sutheros or the Summer Islands, there is one place in particular that I know the writers likely could not resist taking Corlys to, that being Valyria. Now, on one hand, it might be cool to see what remains of the once great civilization after it was consumed in a cataclysmic doom, but on the other hand, we are told repeatedly that traveling to Valyria is essentially impossible. Many have tried to travel there, including a dragon lord who was away from Valyria at the time of the doom. Orion had an enormous dragon and rallied an army of 30,000 men to reclaim his homeland, but despite his dragon and his army, Orion was never seen again. There are likely only 2 characters who have been to Valyria and lived: Euron Greyjoy, who claims to have looted several powerful magical artifacts, and possibly Princess Arya Targaryen, who fled Westeros on Balerion only to return a year later filled with horrific worms that melted her from the inside out. In both cases, those who ventured to Valyria returned with something clearly identifiable as evidence that they had been to the doomed freehold. If Corlys canonically ventured to Valyria, he would have almost certainly returned with a wealth of magical artifacts like dragon-binding horns, Valyrian steel blades, armor, and ancient magical scrolls. Or like Arya, he would return with horrific parasites, or at least would have seen his crew succumb to these magical horrors. Since Corlys does not have worms, nor Valyrian wealth, I think it is safe to say that he never sailed there canonically, and if the animated show does take him to Valyria, I think we might lose the sense of mystery and wonder of what lingers on the doomed peninsula. Overall, the animated Corlys Velaryon show does have promise, but given that there is so much unknown about 5 of the 9 voyages, it is likely that writing staff will have a difficult time implementing their own stories that can stand toe-to-toe with George's works. There is also an Aegon's Conquest series that has been reported to be in the early stages of development, with screenwriter Mattson Tomlin attached. Tomlin has worked on a number of projects. Most notably, he contributed to the scripts for The Batman and The Batman Part 2. The Aegon's Conquest series follows Aegon the Conqueror, his 2 sister wives, and their 3 fully grown dragons as they wage a campaign to unite Westeros into 7 kingdoms under their rule, culminating with the creation of the Iron Throne. We can expect to see several monumental historical events brought to light, like the burning of Harrenhal, the Field of Fire, and Aegon's disastrous invasion of Dawn. House of the Dragon revealed that Aegon's motivation to unite the realm was driven by a prophetic dream that he had, where he saw an endless winter and the coming of the White Walkers. He believed that the realm's only chance to defeat the White Walkers was to have a realm united and a Targaryen on the throne. This revelation as to why Aegon chose to conquer the 7 kingdoms will provide an interesting framework for his character. He is not simply conquering for power, land, or wealth. He is doing it for the good of the realm. So we can expect to see a character who has to grapple and weigh the consequences of every decision he makes. Does he wipe out his enemies with fire and blood like the histories would have us believe, or will he be conflicted, knowing that every life that he extinguishes impacts upon humanity's population and thus reduces their chance to survive against the oncoming doom from the north? For this reason, expect a more nuanced character. He is not simply a conqueror, but a man burdened with the weight of the world and a prophecy of doom upon his shoulders. This attitude of a pragmatic ruler is somewhat present in the books. In the books, despite being known as the Conqueror, Aegon was forgiving and open-handed, often offering his enemies the chance to bend the knee. Those that did were able to retain the majority of their power, like Arya Stark. So the show presents an interesting medium to flesh out Aegon's motivations and character. The show will also explore Aegon's sister wives, who are arguably more interesting. The dynamic between the siblings should be captivating. Specifically, Visenya will be an interesting character to bring to live action. In many ways, she is like Daemon, a fierce warrior who's no stranger to brutality. But unlike Daemon in House of the Dragon at least, Visenya knows when to employ restraint and bide her time. Overall, Aegon's Conquest looks promising. There is extensive material to base the series on, outlined primarily in Fire and Blood, and there are hints of characters' personalities and motivations that could be explored in an interesting and unique way in the TV show. Perhaps one of the lesser known spin-off series under development is an animated series set to explore the Golden Empire of Yi Ti. Yi Ti is a region in the east of Essos, loosely based on the histories of Southeast Asia and Imperial China. Yi Ti is possibly the oldest empire in the Game of Thrones universe, and George has written a decent amount about the empire and the 11 god emperors who ruled it. A release date for the series has not been announced, but as of March 2022, George Martin confirmed that the project was still being developed. Recent rumors have been spreading that Maisie Williams may return as Arya Stark in her own spin-off series. Most of the rumors spread from a post that George R.R. Martin made on his Nodder blog, where he stated that he caught up with Maisie Williams and hinted that there might be something in the works, but he did not want to jinx it. At the conclusion of Game of Thrones, Arya was intent on discovering what lay west of Westeros. In the books, there have been several historical characters who attempted the same mission, but none of them were ever heard from again, the most famous of which was Alyssa Farman. Although Alyssa was never heard from again, her ship, the Sun Chaser, was seen decades later by Corlys Velaryon when he travelled to Asshai in the Far East, which implied that sailing west of Westeros takes you around the globe to arrive in the Far East. So given this somewhat obscure book lore, I would suspect that an Arya series would eventually end up in Asshai. Asshai is one of the more mysterious and intriguing places in the known world, a home to a significant amount of magic users, where arcane knowledge is embraced. The city sits upon the River Ash. By day, the river is black, but at night, it glows a pale green, and the fish in the river are deformed. Asshai gives off the impression that some great calamity once sundered the land, and a sort of magical radiation now contaminates and poisons the area. Beyond the journey west to Asshai, there is little to indicate what the story will be about, but given that it would be a sequel series, it would be a departure narratively from George's written works, though the potential for the show to explore the unknown regions of the world is compelling. Maisie returning as Arya would likely draw in Game of Thrones fans to see where the character goes next. However, for now, the Arya Stark series is nothing more than a rumor. 10,000 Ships is a spin-off series set 1,000 years before the events of Game of Thrones. It follows Princess Nymeria as she leads what remains of her people, the Rhoynar, in search of a new home after a devastating war against Valyria has left them homeless. After some time in development, the project was shelved for a number of years, but has seemingly been picked up again. Flea Bottom was a cancelled series to be set in the slums of King's Landing, where we would have got a look at the underbelly of the largest city in Westeros, where crime is rampant. There is very few details about this one, and from the synopsis alone, it is no wonder that this series got canned. The final spin-off to discuss was a pitch made to create a series about Old Valyria, which would have explored the Dragon Lord's civilization, customs, and secrets in the years leading up to the doom of Valyria. Max Borenstein, a screenwriter who has worked on a number of Godzilla and Kong movies, was heavily attached, but there are very few details about this series beyond that. Personally, I think an exploration of Valyria and a deep dive into dragon lore would have been a compelling enough watch on its own, and adding in the political backstabbing reminiscent of ancient Rome, and I think we could have seen something pretty interesting. Though, admittedly, George has written little and less about the true mysteries of Valyria, so unless he was attached to the project in a significant capacity, which seems unlikely, I am kinda glad that this one has been cancelled or shelved. But what do you think? Which spin-off excites you the most? Comment below.